The mighty Roman Empire did not simply fall. It fractured from within, one economic tremor at a time. For centuries, historians have focused on dramatic invasions and epic battles to explain the empire's end. But the true collapse was quieter, slower, and far more insidious. It was a financial and logistical breakdown that hollowed out the state long before any barbarian king claimed a throne. This is the story of how two silent killers, hyperinflation and supply chain failure, dismantled the greatest power of the ancient world from the inside out. By the end, you will understand the precise economic mechanisms that can cripple even the most formidable superpower, a lesson written not in stone but in crumbling currency and abandoned trade routes. How does a society function when its money becomes worthless and its lifelines are severed? What we uncover is not just a tale of ancient ruin, but a masterclass in the fragile foundations of any complex civilization. When you think of a fallen empire, what is the first crack you picture? To understand the collapse, we must first see the empire at its peak. For 2 centuries, beginning with Augustus, Rome was not just a political power but an economic marvel. Its stability rested on a few brilliantly engineered pillars that seemed unshakable. The first and most critical was a trusted currency. The silver denarius was the dollar of the ancient world, accepted from the markets of Rome to the trading posts of India. Its consistent silver content meant a soldier knew his pay was sound. A merchant in Gaul could trust a contract written in Syria, and the state could collect taxes in a uniform value. This was the glue that held a vast, diverse territory together into a single economic zone. Then came the physical network, a logistical achievement that would not be matched for over 1,000 years. Over 50,000 miles of stone-paved roads radiated from the golden milestone in the Roman Forum, connecting fortified legionary camps to bustling ports. Couriers could travel up to 100 miles a day. More importantly, the Mediterranean Sea, which the Romans called Mare Nostrum, our sea, became a protected highway. Grain freighters, some capable of carrying over 1,000 tons, made predictable voyages from the fertile fields of Egypt and North Africa directly to the port of Ostia. This was not just trade, it was a state-managed supply chain, ensuring that the million inhabitants of Rome itself were fed. The empire's heart beat to the rhythm of these ships. Finally, a relatively efficient bureaucracy and taxation system turned this economic activity into state power. Taxes on land, customs duties at ports, and a poll tax were collected largely in coin. This revenue reliably paid the army, the civil service, and funded monumental public works like aqueducts and baths. The system was a virtuous cycle. Secure roads and seas enabled commerce. Commerce generated taxable wealth, and that wealth paid for the armies that kept the roads and seas secure. It created a period of unprecedented internal peace and connectivity, the Pax Romana. For generations, this machine hummed along, making the empire seem eternal. But what happens when you begin to remove the fundamental pillars one by one and replace them with weaker substitutes? The first sign of trouble would appear in the one thing every Roman touched every day, the money in their purse. That golden age of stability began to shudder in the middle of the 3rd century. A perfect storm of crises descended upon the empire, one that would test its economic foundations to the breaking point. For 50 brutal years, the Roman world was plunged into chaos. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed, often assassinated by their own troops in a relentless series of civil wars. Simultaneously, powerful new confederations of Germanic tribes pressed across the Rhine and Danube frontiers, while a resurgent Persian empire threatened from the east. To compound the misery, a devastating plague swept through the population, further straining resources and morale. The state's survival was suddenly in question, and the treasury was being bled dry. The cost of constant warfare, of bribing armies to stay loyal, and of defending multiple frontiers simultaneously was astronomical. The old, reliable system of taxation could not keep pace with such explosive, unplanned expenditure. Faced with imminent collapse, the emperors made a fateful choice. They turned to the one resource they could control directly, the currency itself. The solution was deceptively simple and utterly destructive. To pay the armies and keep the government functioning, the imperial mints began to systematically reduce the silver content in the denarius. At first, the changes were subtle. But over decades, what was once a coin of nearly pure silver became a thin silver wash over a core of cheap copper or bronze. Imagine you are a Roman soldier. Your pay is still the same number of coins, but their intrinsic value, the actual precious metal you hold, has been secretly cut in half, then by 3/4, then by 90%. This was not a one-time emergency measure, it became standard policy. The state was essentially printing money, creating more nominal currency to cover its bills, but each new coin was worth less than the one before. The immediate crisis was patched over, the armies were paid, and the empire survived the 3rd century intact. But a profound, invisible damage had been done. The trust that had made the denarius a global currency, the bedrock of all economic activity, began to evaporate. People were not fools. Merchants, farmers, and soldiers could feel the lighter coins, see the copper bleeding through the worn edges. A silent understanding spread through the marketplace. If the government would not honor its own money, why should anyone else? This was the first deep crack in the pillar of Roman power. It sowed a seed of doubt that would eventually grow into a monster of hyperinflation. But that monster needed one more condition to truly awaken. What happens to an economy when the money supply explodes, but the actual goods available for purchase begin to disappear? The silent devaluation of the coinage set a dangerous precedent. By the time Emperor Diocletian took power in 284, the financial system was already teetering. His reign, famous for restoring political order, witnessed the final, logical consequence of a century of monetary tampering. The process of debasement did not stop, it accelerated. Under the pressure of funding his massive military reforms and building projects, the silver denarius was reduced to a mere token. The final coins were little more than bronze blanks with the faintest silver wash, a ghost of the empire's former prosperity. The government could now mint coins in almost limitless quantities to meet its obligations. But this created a devastating economic truth. There was a flood of currency chasing a finite amount of goods. This is the textbook recipe for hyperinflation. In the markets, the effect was immediate and terrifying. Prices began to spiral out of control. A measure of wheat that cost a handful of coins one year might cost a sackful the next. Soldiers found their salaries could no longer feed their families despite being paid in stacks of increasingly worthless metal. Savings evaporated overnight. Long-distance trade, which relied on stable values, became a gamble. The very concept of money as a store of value, a pillar of the Pax Romana, had completely collapsed. People lost faith not just in the coin, but in the state's ability to manage its most basic function. In a desperate attempt to command what the market would not, Diocletian issued his famous Edict on maximum prices in 301. It was a staggering document, a 1,000-point list that fixed the maximum cost for everything from a day's wages for a carpenter to the price of a single egg. The edict itself is proof of the chaos, a ruler trying to legislate against the tide of economic reality. It was a catastrophic failure. Enforcing it across the empire was impossible. Goods simply vanished from official markets, sold instead in hidden, illegal transactions at far higher prices. The edict was soon ignored and quietly abandoned, a monument to the impossibility of controlling an economy that no longer trusted its foundation. The state had broken its compact with the people, and the response was a collective, silent retreat from the formal economy. But this monetary catastrophe alone did not shatter the empire. It created a desperate vulnerability, a body weakened by fever. The fatal blow would come from the severing of its physical lifelines, the networks that had once made Rome invincible. Hyperinflation did more than just raise prices. It rewired the entire psychology of the Roman economy. When money ceases to be a reliable store of value, every fundamental assumption about saving, planning, and trust begins to crumble. Picture a farmer who has sold his harvest for a chest full of coins, planning to use that money in a few months to repair his roof and buy seed for the next planting. As the weeks pass, he watches in helpless frustration as the purchasing power of that chest evaporates. His life's work, converted into currency, is melting away before his eyes. This destruction of savings meant no one could plan for the future. Why invest in a new workshop or a better vineyard if the profits would be collected in a currency that might be worthless by the time the project bears fruit? Long-distance commerce, the empire's lifeblood, became a perilous gamble. A merchant shipping wine from Italy to Britain could not calculate his profit because the value of the payment he would receive months later was utterly unpredictable. The rational response was to retreat, to deal only locally and in immediate barter, strangling the complex trade networks that had enriched and integrated the empire. This crisis triggered a desperate scramble for real, tangible value. People stopped wanting money and started wanting things that money could buy before the money lost its power. This behavior is called flight to real assets. The wealthy converted their crumbling fortunes into land, which always had inherent value, or into gold and silver bullion, hoarding precious metal in its raw form. The common citizen, with fewer options, hoarded essentials, grain, olive oil, wine, or tools. This hoarding, while perfectly logical for the individual, made the collective crisis worse. Goods disappeared from the market, further driving up prices for those who had nothing to trade but the failing coins. A brutal new economic hierarchy emerged. Wealth was no longer measured in currency, but in ownership of productive land and stockpiles of real goods. The gap between the propertied class and those dependent on cash incomes, like soldiers, civil servants, and urban laborers, became a chasm. Most destructively, hyperinflation shattered the social contract that had held the Roman state together for centuries. The Roman state's most sacred promise was to its soldiers: pay them reliably, and they will defend the frontiers. Now a legionary would receive his salary, a heavy sack of bronze coins that seemed substantial, only to find it could not feed his family for a week. The tangible symbol of his service and his loyalty was rendered meaningless. How could a soldier feel allegiance to a state that paid him in bad faith? The same betrayal echoed for citizens who paid taxes in this devalued currency, only to see public services decline and infrastructure decay. Trust in the system evaporated, replaced by a focus on immediate local survival. Communities turned inward, relying on personal connections and barter, while the abstract idea of a unified Roman economy faded into memory. The empire was not just becoming poorer, it was becoming psychologically fragmented, its people united in nothing but a shared loss of faith. And as the monetary system collapsed inward, the physical systems that moved the empire's lifeblood were facing external threats of their own. While the currency was imploding from within, the empire's physical body was being starved of its lifeblood. The Roman economy was not a collection of self-sufficient towns. It was a single, sprawling organism sustained by an intricate web of long-distance supply chains. Its survival depended on the constant, predictable flow of goods across thousands of miles, a logistical ballet that required absolute security and perfect coordination. The most critical of these flows was the state-managed grain supply, known as the Annona. Each year, a massive fleet of specialized cargo ships, the naves honorariae, would sail from the fertile provinces of Egypt and North Africa, their holds packed with millions of measures of wheat. This was not mere trade, it was the direct fuel for the city of Rome itself, feeding a population that had long outgrown the capacity of its local farms. The arrival of the grain fleet at Ostia was a matter of public celebration and profound relief, for its failure meant immediate hunger and potential riots in the capital. But the Annona was just the most visible artery. Parallel networks pulsed with other essential commodities. Vast amphorae of olive oil, a staple for cooking, lighting, and hygiene, sailed from the groves of southern Spain and North Africa. Wine traveled from the vineyards of Italy, Gaul, and the Greek islands. The metals needed for coins, weapons, and tools were extracted from specific, far-flung regions: Spanish silver, British tin, and Dalmatian iron, all requiring secure overland and sea routes to reach imperial workshops. Even military security was a supply chain issue. Legionary forts on the frontiers were not self-sufficient. They relied on regular shipments of standardized equipment, from mass-produced nails and pottery to the intricate components of armor and weapons, often manufactured in centralized imperial factories hundreds of miles away. This system created incredible efficiency through geographic specialization. A province could focus on what it did best, knowing it could exchange its surplus for everything else it needed from elsewhere in the empire. Southern Spain could pour its energy into olive oil production because it could import grain from Africa and fine pottery from Italy. This interconnectedness was the source of Roman prosperity and resilience, but it also created a profound and hidden vulnerability. The entire edifice was built on one non-negotiable assumption: that the roads were safe and the sea lanes were clear. The system had no backup plan, no local redundancy. If the flow was interrupted, the specialized regions could not suddenly feed or arm themselves. The empire's strength had become its greatest point of failure, a magnificent but brittle machine waiting for a single, well-placed shock to seize its gears. That shock was already building on the horizon, not from a single enemy, but from a creeping collapse of the very security that made the Roman world possible. Security was the invisible fuel of the Roman supply chain, and that fuel was running out. The creeping internal breakdown began not with a dramatic invasion, but with a slow, corrosive decay of the very peace that had made the empire work. As the 3rd century crisis bled into the 4th, the famed Roman roads, once symbols of imperial control, became increasingly dangerous. Banditry was no longer a fringe problem but a widespread hazard. Local militias, often underfunded and demoralized, could not secure every mile of the vast network. For a merchant transporting a wagon of goods from one province to another, the journey transformed from a routine commercial venture into a perilous gamble. The cost of this risk had to be factored into the price of everything. Hiring armed guards, paying bribes to local strongmen for safe passage, and accepting higher rates of loss from theft all made long-distance overland transport prohibitively expensive. The stone paving itself, a marvel of engineering, began to suffer from neglect. Maintaining 50,000 miles of roadway was a monumental task that fell to local municipalities and the landowning elites known as the curial class. These were the men who formed town councils, the backbone of Roman provincial administration. For centuries, they took pride in funding road repairs, aqueducts, and public buildings, earning social prestige in return. But as the imperial tax burden grew heavier to fund the endless wars and the hyperinflation ravaged their cash-based wealth, this class was squeezed into ruin. Many were held personally responsible for their town's tax quota, a debt that could consume their family estates. The honorable duty of curating a city became a financial death sentence. The clever and wealthy found ways to escape the burden, joining the imperial bureaucracy or the clergy, which offered exemptions. Those who remained were often impoverished, unable to fund even the most basic maintenance. A pothole on the Via Appia was more than an inconvenience. It was a symptom of a civic spirit breaking under fiscal pressure. With roads crumbling and journeys growing unsafe, the economic logic of the empire inverted. Why import heavy, bulky goods like grain or pottery from 1,000 miles away when the transport cost might double or triple the price if the shipment arrived at all? Local regions, once happily specialized, were forced to turn inward. A town in Gaul might abandon its fine pottery imports from Italy and make do with cruder local wares. A Spanish olive oil producer might find his major markets in Rome and Britain increasingly out of reach, his amphorae sitting unused on the docks. This localization of economies was a rational response to chaos, but it shattered the integrated system that had created Roman abundance. It meant less variety, lower quality goods, and the loss of the efficiencies of scale. Most critically, it severed the interdependent relationships that bound the provinces to each other and to the imperial center. The empire was not being conquered all at once. It was quietly disconnecting, one abandoned trade route at a time. The sea, however, had always been Rome's greatest highway. Could this vast, liquid road save the system from its terrestrial collapse? The sea, Rome's great liquid highway, offered no escape from the gathering storm. In fact, it became the very avenue for the empire's most devastating logistical blow. For centuries, the province of North Africa had been the economic engine room of the Western Empire, a sun-drenched breadbasket whose fertile fields were more vital than any battlefield. Its loss was not a slow erosion but a sudden, catastrophic amputation. In the year 439, a Germanic people known as the Vandals, who had migrated across Gaul and Spain, did the unthinkable. They crossed the Strait of Gibraltar not as raiders but as conquerors. With stunning speed, they captured Carthage, the magnificent capital of Roman Africa and the hub of the entire Western Mediterranean grain trade. In a single stroke, the Vandals seized control of the docks, the warehouses, and the vast agricultural estates that had fed Rome for generations. The annual grain fleet from Africa simply stopped. The effect on the city of Rome was immediate and profound. The rhythm of life had been tied to the arrival of those ships for so long that their absence created a palpable void. The state-sponsored grain dole, which for centuries had guaranteed a basic subsistence for hundreds of thousands of the city's poor, was thrown into chaos. Prices for what little grain remained in Italy skyrocketed overnight, plunging the urban population into a state of anxiety and hunger. The psychological impact was perhaps even greater than the physical one. For the first time, the people of Rome could feel the empire's vulnerability in their own stomachs. The government in Ravenna was forced into a desperate scramble. It now had to source grain from elsewhere, primarily from Sicily and increasingly from the Eastern Empire. But this was a logistical nightmare. These alternative sources were more distant, their transport routes longer and more exposed to both piracy and the unpredictable weather of the Adriatic and Ionian seas. The cost, both financial and in terms of imperial attention, was staggering. Every ship and soldier diverted to protect a grain convoy from Egypt was a resource taken from a beleaguered frontier elsewhere. The Vandal capture of Africa did more than just create a food shortage. It fundamentally broke the economic model of the Western Empire. The province had been one of the wealthiest in the West, contributing massive tax revenues in both grain and gold. That revenue stream vanished, flowing instead into the treasury of the Vandal kingdom, which promptly became a formidable naval power, using Roman ships to raid the coasts of Italy and Sicily. So the empire was not only starved of food and money, it was also menaced by a new enemy fleet born from its own stolen resources. This was a triple catastrophe, a shock from which the Western imperial system could never truly recover. It revealed a terrifying new reality. The empire's heartland in Italy was now a dependent, not a provider, relying on the charity and capability of others for its most basic needs. The intricate machine had lost its most crucial gear, and the grinding noise that followed was the sound of an empire winding down. If the loss of Africa was a severed artery, the next fractures would see the entire body slowly go numb, as the empire's peripheral limbs began to disconnect and function on their own. The two silent crises of money and logistics were now locked in a fatal embrace, each feeding the other in a downward spiral with no escape. This was the fiscal-military death spiral, the final, self-reinforcing mechanism that dismantled Roman power. It began with the simple, impossible math of paying a massive army with worthless currency. A legionary's loyalty was purchased with reliable pay, a promise etched in silver. But as hyperinflation raged, his salary, even if increased in number, could not buy the essentials for his family. The tangible reward for frontier service had vanished. The result was not just poverty, but a deep-seated disillusionment that corroded military discipline from within. Units became restless, their allegiance shifting from the distant emperor to whichever local commander could provide for them, often through outright extortion of the civilian population they were supposed to protect. Mutinies and civil wars became a regular feature of imperial politics, as armies made and unmade emperors in a desperate search for financial stability. This constant internal strife meant the legions were often fighting each other instead of guarding the frontiers. A weakened, distracted military could no longer guarantee the security that was the bedrock of Roman economics. Bandits grew bolder on neglected roads. Provincial towns, once confident in imperial protection, found themselves isolated. Long-distance merchants facing unacceptable risks stopped their shipments. Each abandoned trade route meant another fracture in the supply chain, another region forced into a poorer, more isolated existence. This logistical collapse then struck directly at the state's ability to fund itself. The Roman tax system was sophisticated but brittle. It relied on a stable, monetized economy and safe transport to move revenue. As provinces became insecure and trade localized, the taxable wealth of the empire simply evaporated. A farmer whose fields were raided could not pay his taxes. A merchant who could not ship his goods generated no customs duties. The great estates that had been the backbone of the tax base now hoarded their wealth in kind, hiding it from imperial collectors. With its traditional revenue streams drying up, the imperial government faced the same desperate choice it had for centuries, but now with far fewer options. To pay the very army that was failing to secure the revenue, it had no choice but to return to the printing press of the ancient world, debasing the coinage even further. They minted more and more of the bronze nummi, flooding the market with currency that everyone knew was essentially worthless. This fresh wave of minting accelerated the hyperinflation, making the soldiers pay even more hollow, which in turn fueled more military discontent and less effective frontier defense. The spiral tightened with each turn. Less security meant less trade and lower taxes. Lower taxes meant more desperate currency debasement. More debasement meant a more furious and underpaid military, which provided even less security. It was a closed loop of failure where every attempted solution only deepened the core problem. The empire was not being toppled by an external force. It was being consumed by its own internal logic. The magnificent system of the Pax Romana had engineered its own doom, transforming the tools of integration and control into instruments of fragmentation and collapse. So what remained when the money was trash and the roads led nowhere? The final act of this economic unraveling would see the very idea of Rome retreat into 1,000 local fortresses, as people stopped looking to the empire and started looking only to their own walls. The state now faced an impossible accounting problem. Its own hyperinflation had destroyed the very tool it needed to fund itself, coin. Imagine a tax collector arriving at a prosperous farm in Gaul. His scrolls demanded a payment of, say, 1,000 denarii for the year's land tax. but both he and the farmer knew those 1,000 coins, a hefty sum on paper, might not even buy a single bushel of wheat in the chaotic market. Collecting taxes in this worthless currency was an exercise in futility, gathering stacks of metal that could not pay a soldier or feed a city. The traditional monetary tax system, the financial engine of the empire for centuries, had simply broken down. It was like trying to fill a bucket with sand that kept sifting through the fingers. The government had to find a new way to extract value from its lands, and its solution was a dramatic backward step. It stopped asking for money and started demanding stuff instead. This was the shift to taxation in kind. The state's demands were now listed in tangible goods: so many measures of wheat, so many amphorae of olive oil, so many pounds of pork, or even specific items like uniforms or nails. A province's tax burden was no longer a number but a shopping list for the army and the bureaucracy. This change made a certain brutal sense in a collapsing economy. The grain collected from Egypt could be shipped directly to feed the legions on the Rhine. The leather from Spain could go straight to a military workshop. It cut out the unreliable middleman of currency, but this system also relocalized and simplified the entire economy in a profound way. A region's entire agricultural output became oriented not toward profitable trade, but toward meeting the specific, inflexible demands of the distant state. Innovation and market choice withered. Why experiment with a new, more valuable crop if the taxman only wants a fixed amount of the old staple? The economy began to ossify, locking into patterns designed for survival, not growth. This shift had a second, even more transformative consequence for the people who worked the land, the colony. To ensure its tax list was fulfilled, the state needed to guarantee that the fields were tended and the workshops were manned. In a world of deepening insecurity and vanishing opportunities, many small farmers, crushed by debt and unable to pay even taxes in kind, voluntarily sought the protection of a powerful local landowner, offering their labor in exchange for security. The state, desperate for stable production, made this arrangement permanent through law. Over the course of the 4th and 5th centuries, the colony were gradually bound to the estate where they worked. They could not leave their plot of land, and their children inherited both the obligation to work it and the debt that came with it. This was not yet the full feudalism of the Middle Ages, but it was its direct ancestor. The free peasant farmer, once a cornerstone of the Roman ideal, was disappearing, replaced by a tied laborer whose world shrank to the boundaries of his lord's estate. The grand, interconnected monetary economy of Rome was devolving into a patchwork of self-contained agricultural units. Each large estate, or villa, aimed to produce everything it needed internally, from tools to clothes to food, minimizing its reliance on dangerous and expensive long-distance trade. The complex dance of the Mediterranean market was being replaced by the slow, local rhythm of the manor. For the central state, this was a devil's bargain. It secured a predictable flow of essential goods in the short term, but at a catastrophic long-term cost. Its finances became rigid and primitive. It could no longer easily respond to a crisis by raising funds. It could only demand more sacks of grain from estates that might already be failing. The flexibility that coin had provided, the ability to shift resources instantly across the empire, was gone. The Roman government was slowly turning into just another, albeit very large, landlord, managing a collection of isolated farms rather than governing an integrated state. The economic unity that had defined Rome was fracturing into 1,000 pieces, each focused solely on its own survival. And in this new, fragmented world, where did that leave the ultimate symbol of Roman unity, the city of Rome itself? Rome itself, the eternal city, was becoming a relic of a bygone system. As the central government's ability to provide security and stable currency evaporated, people across the Western Empire made a rational, if grim, calculation. They stopped looking to the distant emperor and started looking to the nearest strongman with a wall. The societal response to broken supply chains and worthless money was a great retreat inward, a desperate scramble for localized self-sufficiency known as autarky. This was not progress, it was the economic equivalent of a body pulling blood flow from its extremities to protect its vital organs. The most visible symbol of this new reality was the transformation of the countryside. The classic Roman villa, once an elegant country house for leisure and agricultural management, began to change. It grew larger, more fortified, and far more insular. Stone walls and watchtowers replaced decorative gardens. These were no longer just homes, they were miniature fortresses and self-contained economic units. The ideal was stark: produce everything you need within the boundaries of your own estate. Where a villa of the early empire might have imported fine pottery from Italy, olive oil from Spain, and wine from Gaul, the late Roman villa aimed to make its own rough pottery, press its own oil from local groves, and ferment its own wine. Workshops for blacksmiths, weavers, and carpenters were built within the compound walls. The goal was to minimize any reliance on the dangerous, unpredictable, and monetized outside world. This shift represented a profound privatization of power. As the Roman state receded, the wealthy landowner, the dominus, stepped into the vacuum. He was no longer just a taxpayer, he was a local ruler. His fortified villa provided physical security for the surrounding population of tied farmers, the coloni, who in turn worked his land. He administered local justice, organized defense against bandits, and controlled the stockpiles of grain and goods. The complex, abstract authority of the Roman bureaucracy was replaced by the immediate, tangible authority of the lord in his manor. This was not an innovation born of ambition, but a survival mechanism born of systemic failure. The villa economy was a direct symptom of economic disintegration. Every workshop built inside a wall was a testament to a trade route that had died. Every bushel of grain stored in a private granary instead of shipped to a public market represented a breakdown in the imperial supply chain. The vibrant, interconnected Mediterranean economy was hardening into a patchwork of isolated, self-interested cells. Money, the great lubricant of Roman society, had little function here. Transactions between the lord and his laborers were conducted in kind, through shares of the harvest or provision of shelter and protection. Barter between estates was clumsy and limited. The elegant efficiency of the silver denarius was gone, replaced by the cumbersome logistics of moving sacks of grain and barrels of wine. This retreat to autarky solved the immediate problem of survival for those within the walls, but it accelerated the empire's fragmentation. It redirected loyalty from the state to the local patron. It turned economic energy inward, starving the broader system of innovation and exchange. The Roman world was not conquered in a day. It quietly dismantled itself, one self-sufficient estate at a time, as people learned to live without the empire long before the empire officially ceased to be. And in this new, fractured landscape, what final form would the remnants of Roman power take when even the pretense of central control became too heavy a burden to carry? Diocletian understood that the empire's sickness ran far deeper than prices alone. His response was a monumental, top-down effort to rebuild the Roman state from its foundations, an attempt to impose order through sheer administrative will. Beyond the infamous Price Edict, he launched a total restructuring of imperial governance, slicing the vast empire into over 100 smaller provinces. These were then grouped into 12 dioceses, each overseen by a vicar, who reported to one of 4 regional prefects, who ultimately answered to Diocletian and his co-emperor. This system, the Tetrarchy, was designed to make provincial governors weaker and more manageable, bringing government closer to the people for faster response and tighter control. In theory, it was a masterpiece of bureaucratic engineering. In practice, it created a vast new layer of officialdom that required salaries, offices, and feeding, all paid for by the very economy it was trying to save. The state was trying to cure a patient by adding more weight to its already broken skeleton. His economic vision extended to the very structure of society itself. Diocletian sought to freeze the Roman economy in time. He issued laws binding sons to their father's professions. A baker's son had to become a baker. A shipper's son had to become a shipper. The aim was to guarantee the essential services and trades the state relied upon, ensuring a stable supply of bread, transport, and arms. But this attempt to legislate against economic reality created a society of inherited obligation, stripping away social mobility and personal choice. It treated people not as citizens but as fixed components in a failing machine, breeding resentment and stifling the very innovation that might have sparked recovery. Most consequentially, Diocletian overhauled the entire tax system, moving decisively away from the unreliable monetary model. He established the capitatio, a new land and head tax. Imperial surveyors assessed every piece of farmland for its productive capacity, measured in units called iuga. At the same time, they counted the labor force, the capita, the heads of people and animals available to work the land. The tax demand was then calculated as a combination of these two factors, the productive potential of the land plus the labor to work it, and it was levied almost entirely in kind. Every year, each province knew exactly how many wagon loads of grain, jars of oil, or lengths of cloth it owed to the state. On paper, this was a rational solution. It provided the government with a predictable, tangible income of the exact goods it needed to feed the army and the bureaucracy, bypassing the worthless currency altogether. Yet the failure of these heavy-handed reforms was baked into their design. They addressed the symptoms of collapse with more control, not the root causes. The new bureaucracy, while impressive in its scope, became a self-perpetuating burden. Every new official, every tax assessor and provincial administrator was another mouth to feed from the very tax shipments they were organizing, creating a vicious cycle of extraction. The frozen occupations ignored why professions were failing in the first place: the dangers of travel, the collapse of long-distance markets, and the lack of a reliable monetary reward. Forcing a man to be a shipper could not make the sea lanes safe or his business profitable, and while the capitatio tax provided short-term stability, it institutionalized the economic retreat we just witnessed. By taxing based on fixed assessments of land and heads, it actively discouraged improvement. Why would a farmer clear new fields or invest in better irrigation if it simply meant a higher tax assessment the following year? The system punished productivity and encouraged the hiding of resources. It locked the empire into a static, defensive economic posture, concerned only with meeting the state's annual demand, not with growing wealth or rebuilding connections. Diocletian's reforms were a desperate holding action, a massive dam built against a rising flood. They shored up the empire for another century, but they did so by making it rigid, oppressive, and brittle. The state had saved itself by becoming something different, something heavier and less adaptable. It traded the dynamic, integrated economy of the early empire for a controlled, extractive system designed for survival, not prosperity. And when the next great shock came, this rigid system would prove unable to bend, leaving it with only one possible outcome. Diocletian's rigid new system came with an astronomical price tag. To administer 100 provinces, manage a frozen economy, and collect taxes in kind required an army of civil servants, a bureaucracy of unprecedented scale. This was not just a government, it was a vast, hungry organism that needed constant feeding. Every new official, from the provincial governor down to the lowliest tax clerk, demanded a salary, housing, and support staff. The expanded military, reorganized into frontier guards and mobile field armies, required even more. These were not merely employees, they were the essential cogs in the machine of control, and their loyalty had to be purchased. But here was the fatal flaw. This immense overhead was funded almost entirely by the very system it was meant to save. The salaries, the donatives to the troops, the operating costs of countless officers, all were paid out in the empire's own devalued currency. The state was caught in a paradox of its own making. It had to mint staggering quantities of bronze coins to meet its payroll, a process that further flooded the market and accelerated the hyperinflation it was trying to escape. Each new batch of coins paid to a soldier or a scribe made every coin already in circulation worth a little less, creating a need for even more coins next time. It was a financial Ouroboros, the state eating its own monetary tail. The bureaucracy, designed as a solution, had become a primary driver of the crisis. Consider the journey of a single tax shipment from a farm in Gaul to a legionary fort on the Danube. The grain was assessed by one official, measured by another, recorded by a scribe, stored in a state warehouse managed by a procurator, loaded onto a wagon by state contractors, transported along roads patrolled by state soldiers, and finally distributed by a military quartermaster. At every single step, someone took a cut, either in official salary or in unofficial graft, all funded by the value of the grain itself. The system was so bloated with administrative friction that a huge portion of the empire's actual agricultural surplus was consumed not by the people or even the frontline troops, but by the very process of moving it from point A to point B. This overhead solved none of the underlying problems. It did not make the roads safer from bandits. It did not increase farm yields through innovation. It did not restore trust in commerce. It simply added a crushing layer of cost onto an economy that was already struggling to breathe. The Roman state had built a magnificent apparatus for extraction and control, but it had forgotten how to cultivate the wealth that needed extracting. The bureaucracy became an end in itself, a self-perpetuating entity whose primary function was its own maintenance. In the end, the empire was not defeated by a lack of soldiers or walls, but by a simple, unsustainable equation. The cost of protecting and administering its territory had grown to exceed the wealth that territory could reliably produce, especially through the broken medium of its own currency. The machine was now so heavy it was sinking into the very ground it was built to govern. The grand administrative machine was starving the very cities it was meant to rule. You could see the empire's economic sickness most clearly not on a balance sheet, but in the silent, emptying spaces of its urban heart. Roman cities were not just population centers, they were the ultimate expression of a complex, monetized economy. Their bustling forums, crowded apartment blocks, and thriving workshops were entirely dependent on the constant flow of goods and currency from a secure hinterland. As that flow slowed to a trickle, the urban fabric began to unravel. The first and most telling change was the quiet abandonment of large-scale public works. For centuries, the construction of aqueducts, bathhouses, theaters, and basilicas had been a point of civic pride, funded by wealthy patrons and municipal treasuries flush with tax revenue. Now that revenue was gone, siphoned away to feed the distant imperial bureaucracy and army, a cracked pipe in an aqueduct went unrepaired, a colonnade damaged by weather was left to crumble. The great civic projects that had defined Roman urban life simply stopped, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a gradual, pervasive neglect. The energy and capital required for such monuments had vanished, redirected to the grim business of basic survival. This decline rippled through the economic life of the city. Specialized artisan workshops, the hallmark of a sophisticated economy, began to close their doors. Consider a master glassblower or a fine bronze smith. His craft relied on specialized raw materials that might come from hundreds of miles away, and his customers were a dispersed network of wealthy patrons who paid in reliable coin. With supply chains fractured and the wealthy hoarding their wealth in land and grain, both his materials and his market evaporated. The exquisite, standardized goods of the early empire were replaced by cruder, locally made alternatives. Pottery became simpler, metals thinner, glass less refined. Economic complexity was simplifying, reverting to a more basic mode of production where the priority was function over beauty and local availability over quality. The physical space of commerce itself began to shrink. The sprawling mausoleum, the covered market that once hummed with vendors selling spices from the east, textiles from Egypt, and wine from across the sea, grew quiet. Many of its stalls were boarded up. The commercial quarters of the city, once vibrant and crowded, contracted. Long-distance merchants no longer found it profitable or safe to make the journey. Without a trustworthy currency to facilitate easy exchange, the simple act of buying and selling became a cumbersome negotiation of barter. How many sacks of grain equal a new tunic? How many pots of olive oil for an iron tool? This inefficiency stifled trade and made cities less attractive places to live and do business. People voted with their feet. Faced with hunger, insecurity, and a broken monetary system, many urban dwellers did what was rational. They left. Some returned to the countryside, seeking protection and sustenance on the fortified estates we discussed earlier. Others simply moved to smaller, more defensible hilltop settlements, leaving the sprawling classical city behind. The population of major urban centers like Rome, Milan, and Arles dwindled. The great, crowded apartment blocks, the insulae, slowly emptied. Public squares that had echoed with political debate and commercial haggling fell into a somber quiet, their paving stones gradually buried under wind-blown soil and weeds. This urban decline was not a cause of the empire's fall, but its most visible symptom. It was the tangible proof that the intricate system of money and long-distance supply had broken beyond repair. The light of cosmopolitan Roman life was fading, not in a sudden blackout, but in a slow, room-by-room dimming, as the economic fuel that powered it was exhausted. And in this growing twilight, where would people turn to find order, community, and a reason to look beyond their own immediate survival? The story of this economic unraveling is written not just in imperial decrees, but in the silent soil of the empire's farthest province. Roman Britain offers a perfect and poignant case study of how a thriving regional economy could be extinguished when the wider system that sustained it broke down. For centuries, Britain was not a remote outpost but a prosperous and integral part of the Roman machine. Its economy was built on two powerful exports, grain from its fertile lowlands and metals from its rugged hills. British wheat helped feed the legions on the Rhine, while its rich deposits of tin, lead, and silver were mined under imperial control and shipped across the Channel to continental mints and workshops. In return, Britain imported the luxuries and necessities of Roman life: fine Samian ware pottery from Gaul, glass from Germany, olive oil, and wine from the Mediterranean. Its elite lived in sophisticated villas with underfloor heating and mosaic floors, symbols of their connection to a vast, cosmopolitan world. This was not a self-sufficient island. It was a specialized spoke in a giant imperial wheel, and its prosperity depended entirely on that wheel continuing to turn. The first tremor came with the slow disintegration of the monetary system. As hyperinflation ravaged the continent, the flood of worthless bronze coins eventually reached Britain. But here, archaeology reveals a fascinating and telling response. All across the province, people began to hoard the old, high-quality silver coins from earlier centuries. They buried them in pots in fields, hid them under floorboards, and secreted them in walls. These coin hoards are not evidence of wealth, but of profound distrust. People were rejecting the new, official currency and clinging to the last remnants of sound money, taking it out of circulation in a desperate attempt to preserve value. This act of private salvation had a collective consequence. it further starved the local economy of any reliable medium of exchange, pushing everyday transactions back toward clumsy barter. The death knell, however, was logistical. In the early 5th century, the imperial government, stretched to its limit, made the strategic decision to withdraw the last legions from Britain to defend the heartlands of Gaul and Italy. This was not merely a military retreat, it was the severing of an umbilical cord. The legions were not just defenders, they were the primary consumers of British exports and the ultimate guarantors of safe passage across the North Sea and the English Channel. Once they were gone, the economic rationale for Britain's specialized production collapsed. Who would now buy all that grain and metal? How could a British merchant safely ship goods to a continent now overrun with conflict and crumbling infrastructure? The complex, long-distance supply chains that defined Roman Britain snapped. Almost immediately, the archaeological record shows the lights going out. The great villas, those islands of Roman comfort, were systematically abandoned. Mosaic floors were left to be covered by dust, hypocaust systems fell cold. Without a continental market for their agricultural surplus, the villa economy was no longer viable. The industries died too. The massive lead and silver mines in places like the Mendip Hills show signs of sudden, orderly shutdown, the tools simply put down as the state-sponsored orders ceased. Britain did not descend into immediate darkness, but it underwent a rapid and dramatic simplification. The imported luxuries vanished from the archaeological layers, replaced by locally made, cruder pottery. Towns contracted as long-distance trade dried up. The economy relocalized at a staggering pace, retreating to what could be produced and traded within a very small, very safe radius. The Roman system in Britain did not fall to a massive invasion. It imploded from within when its connection to the larger imperial body was cut. The province did not forget Rome. It was simply forced to learn how to live without it, and in doing so, it became something entirely different. This microcosm shows us the final truth. The Roman economy was a network, and when the nodes are disconnected, the entire system goes dark, not with a bang, but with the quiet sound of a last ship failing to sail from a deserted port. The Roman soldier was far more than just a defender of the frontier. He was a vital economic actor. His regular salary had been a powerful engine of the imperial economy, injecting coins into local markets from Syria to Britain. He bought food, clothing, and services, creating demand that supported entire communities around military camps. But as hyperinflation rendered his official pay a meaningless pile of bronze, this economic function broke down. The state could no longer fulfill its most basic promise, and the relationship between the soldier and the empire underwent a profound and dangerous transformation. To survive, the army had to adapt, and its adaptation would permanently alter the structure of Roman power. The first shift was from a paid professional to a force that lived directly off the land it was supposed to protect. This practice, known as billeting or hospitium, was not new, but it became standard policy. Instead of receiving sound currency to purchase supplies, soldiers were quartered in towns and on private estates. The local population was legally obligated to provide them with food, lodging, and other necessities. On paper, this was a simple solution to the currency crisis, a direct exchange of goods for protection. In reality, it was a form of institutionalized extraction that devastated local economies. Imagine a small farming village along the Danube. One day, a unit of 30 soldiers arrives, demanding shelter in your home and a share of your family's grain stores for the winter. This was not a commercial transaction, it was a compulsory burden. The soldier, now dependent on your hospitality, was no longer a distant symbol of imperial order, but a direct consumer of your livelihood. This system bred immense resentment, blurring the line between protector and occupier, and further eroding the goodwill between the Roman state and its citizens. When even billeting became too chaotic, the state took a more permanent step. It began to grant soldiers plots of land, often on the frontier itself, in lieu of regular pay. A veteran, or sometimes an active soldier, would receive a parcel of farmland to cultivate. His compensation was not coins, but the food he could grow for himself and his family. This practice evolved over time into hereditary military settlements. Sons were expected to follow their fathers into service, defending the same stretch of border their family now called home. On the surface, this created a self-sufficient, motivated frontier force with a direct stake in the land's security, but it also untethered the military from the central state's financial control. A soldier who drew his sustenance from his own fields, and whose loyalty was to his local commander and his neighbors, had little material connection to an emperor in Ravenna or Constantinople. His world narrowed to his immediate locality. His general, who controlled the distribution of this land, became his true patron, the source of his security and livelihood. This localization of the military economy was the final piece of the fragmentation puzzle. The grand, centrally funded Roman army was dissolving into a collection of regional militias tied to local economies and powerful warlords. A general like Stilicho or Aetius in the 5th century West was less a servant of the empire and more a powerful magnate who commanded the personal loyalty of troops he supplied through a combination of land grants and plunder. The soldier's economic identity had completed its journey from a paid professional consumer in a unified imperial market to a land-holding retainer in a local strongman's retinue. When the army is paid from the central treasury, it upholds the state. When the army is paid from local land, its loyalty follows the land, and the idea of a unified Rome becomes little more than a memory. In this new world of fractured loyalties, what final form would the remnants of imperial authority take? And could anything be salvaged from the economic wreckage? With the official currency reduced to scrap metal, society had to invent its own ways to trade. In the marketplace, where once the clink of silver denarii had been a universal language, a cumbersome but practical system re-emerged: barter. Imagine trying to buy a loaf of bread not with coins but with a handful of nails or a pot of honey or a promise of labor. This was the daily reality for most people. A farmer might trade a chicken for a new tunic woven by a local woman. A blacksmith might repair a plow in exchange for a share of the next harvest. While barter solved the immediate problem of distrust in imperial coin, it was wildly inefficient. It required a double coincidence of wants, meaning both parties had to have exactly what the other desired at the same moment. How many eggs equal a new knife? The lack of a common measure of value made every transaction a complex negotiation, stifling trade and locking communities into a narrow, local circle of exchange. For the vast majority of Romans, economic life had shrunk to the scale of their village and the contents of their storerooms. Yet, for large-scale transactions, the empire's elite and the remaining state machinery still needed something reliable. The answer came not from the West but from the still-functioning Eastern Empire. In the early 4th century, Emperor Constantine introduced a new gold coin, the Solidus. Struck with remarkable purity and consistency, the Solidus became the one thing the bronze nummus was not: trustworthy. It was the dollar of the late ancient world, accepted from Constantinople to Carthage. But its very stability created a stark economic divide. A single solidus was worth a fortune in devalued bronze currency, perhaps representing months of a laborer's income. You could not walk into a market and use a gold solidus to buy a single loaf of bread. It was simply too valuable to subdivide for daily needs. This coin became the exclusive currency of high finance, used to pay barbarian mercenaries, fund imperial subsidies, and facilitate trade between wealthy merchants and powerful landowners. It flowed in the rarefied channels of power far above the grubby barter of the common people. The Solidus was a brilliant solution for preserving elite and state wealth, but it did nothing to heal the broken everyday economy below. In the end, the most profound shift was not to a new type of coin, but away from currency altogether. In a world of insecurity, where roads were perilous and governments ephemeral, true wealth and power became rooted in the one thing that could not be devalued, stolen by inflation, or easily moved: land. Land produced food, the ultimate necessity. It provided timber, pasture, and security. Ownership of vast estates became the only meaningful measure of status and the primary source of influence. The late Roman magnate did not count his wealth in coins in a chest, but in the thousands of acres he controlled and the hundreds of tied laborers, the coloni, who worked them. This land was not just an asset, it was a self-sufficient kingdom in miniature, producing its own food, tools, and clothing. Power flowed directly from this control of territory and people. A local warlord or a powerful bishop derived his authority not from an imperial title, but from the bread he could put on his followers' tables and the soldiers he could feed from his own granaries. The Roman world had completed a full economic circle, reverting to a pre-monetary foundation where wealth was real, tangible, and immovable. The elegant abstraction of silver coinage had been replaced by the brute, enduring reality of soil and harvest. When the last Western emperor was deposed in 476, it was less the fall of a state and more the formal acknowledgement of a truth everyone already lived by, that the real empire had long since dissolved into a patchwork of landed estates, each with its own rules, its own economy, and its own lord. This desperate reversion to a land-based economy created a new and brutal logic of power. When the state could no longer tax productivity, it turned to predation. Warfare itself became a primary revenue stream, a destructive cycle that replaced the old, intricate system of sustainable taxation with the blunt force of seizure. Both the crumbling Roman state and the emerging barbarian kingdoms came to operate not as administrators of a settled economy, but as mobile armed bands whose survival depended on what they could take. The Roman military, once the guarantor of peace and commerce, was now often the instrument of its destruction. Generals, struggling to pay and supply their troops without sound currency, would lead armies into friendly provinces to forcibly requisition supplies, a practice barely distinguishable from looting. A region that had already paid its taxes in kind might find itself stripped bare a second time by the very forces meant to protect it, pushing local communities toward complete ruin and leaving them with no incentive to produce a surplus for the next season. This internal plunder hollowed out the empire from within, turning the provinces from assets into exhausted battlefields. For the new barbarian kingdoms settling within the old imperial borders, the calculus was similar but even more stark. Groups like the Visigoths or Vandals arrived not with a sophisticated tax bureaucracy, but with a warrior ethos and immediate needs. They secured their position and wealth through two direct methods: the seizure of landed estates and the imposition of tribute. Roman landowners often saw a portion of their property, typically 2/3, formally redistributed to the new barbarian elite. This was not random destruction. It was a systematic transfer of the primary source of wealth from Roman hands to barbarian control, forever altering the landscape of power. Simultaneously, the conquered Roman population was forced to pay annual tribute to their new overlords, a flow of grain, gold, and goods that directly funded the warrior class. The old, complex tax system that had funded roads and aqueducts was gone, replaced by a simpler, more brutal extraction meant solely to maintain a military aristocracy. This shift to a plunder economy had a chilling effect on long-term stability and production. Why would a farmer invest in improving his fields if the fruits of his labor were likely to be seized by the next army passing through, whether it flew a Roman or a barbarian standard? Economic rationality dictated minimizing risk, producing only what was necessary for immediate survival, and hiding any surplus. The encouragement of peaceful, settled agriculture, the very foundation of Roman prosperity, became impossible. Regions descended into a state of perpetual insecurity, where the greatest threat was not an external invasion, but the regular arrival of one's own supposed protectors or new rulers demanding sustenance. The cycle was self-perpetuating. Less production led to greater need for plunder, and more plunder led to even less production. In this environment, the very idea of a unified, functioning economy faded, replaced by a patchwork of armed camps competing for a shrinking pool of resources. The legacy of Rome was no longer its laws or its currency, but the stark lesson that when the tools of creation break down, the tools of taking over become the only ones left. The empire's labor force was vanishing, while the crises of money and logistics were tearing at the economic fabric. A deeper, more fundamental resource was quietly draining away the people themselves. A severe and sustained population decline acted as a silent multiplier, intensifying every other weakness in the Roman system. This was not a single event, but a relentless pressure applied over generations, from the devastating Antonine and Cyprian plagues of the 2nd and 3rd centuries to the constant attrition of warfare and civil strife. Each wave of illness carried away not just lives, but the accumulated skills, knowledge, and productive capacity of entire communities. Imagine a village where a third of the adults, the farmers, the blacksmiths, the weavers, are lost in a single season. The fields go untended, repairs are left undone, and the local economy seizes up. On a continental scale, this erosion of human capital was catastrophic. Fewer people meant fewer hands to plow the fields, crew the merchant ships, and man the workshops that supplied the empire. Agricultural output, the absolute bedrock of the ancient economy, began to fall. With less grain harvested, there was less surplus to feed the cities, less to tax for the state, and less to trade for other essentials. The intricate supply chains, already fraying from insecurity, now faced a problem of simple scarcity. You cannot maintain a fleet of grain freighters if there are not enough sailors and dockworkers to load them. You cannot operate an imperial arms factory if disease and conflict have decimated the pool of skilled metalworkers. The system required a critical mass of human energy to function, and that mass was dissipating. This demographic collapse created a cruel mathematical reality for the state. The costs of the army and the bloated bureaucracy remained fixed or even grew, but the number of taxpayers available to bear that burden was shrinking. The per capita weight of supporting the imperial machine grew heavier with each passing year. A farmer who might have supported one soldier with his surplus in the past now found himself responsible for the upkeep of 2 or 3, as his neighbors' fields lay fallow. This pushed the surviving rural population toward breaking point, accelerating the flight to the protection of fortified estates and further reducing the taxable, monetized economy. The labor shortage also drove up the cost of what work could be done, putting further strain on state and private budgets already crippled by hyperinflation. In a desperate attempt to freeze society in place, late Roman emperors issued laws binding workers to their professions and their land, turning the colony into hereditary tenants. This was not innovation, it was a stark admission of scarcity, an attempt to legislate against a disappearing workforce. The empire was trying to cure a patient suffering from massive blood loss by tightening a tourniquet, a measure that might briefly stabilize but would ultimately cause the limb to wither. A shrinking population could not sustain the grand ambitions of a superpower. It meant less innovation, less resilience, and a steadily diminishing capacity to recover from each new shock. The Roman world was not just running out of money and safe roads, it was running out of the very people needed to rebuild them. While armies fought and money failed, the very climate of the empire began to shift beneath their feet. Historians and scientists are now uncovering compelling evidence that environmental pressures added one more relentless strain to Rome's buckling economy. Emerging research points to a period of climatic cooling often called the Late Antique Little Ice Age, beginning around the 6th century but with precursors felt earlier. This was not a single catastrophic event, but a creeping change that altered growing seasons and rainfall patterns across the northern hemisphere. For an empire built on the predictable harvests of its breadbasket provinces, even a slight dip in average temperatures could have devastating consequences. Imagine the vineyards of Gaul or the wheat fields of North Africa facing shorter, cooler summers and unexpected late frosts. Crop yields would have gradually declined, not to zero, but to a point where the delicate surplus that fed cities and armies began to vanish. This environmental shift likely intersected with periods of severe regional drought, particularly in the already arid landscapes of the eastern Mediterranean and North Africa. Archaeological studies of lake sediments and tree rings suggest episodes where the rains simply failed for years at a time. For a farmer relying on the annual flood of the Nile or the winter rains in Syria, a multi-year drought was an existential crisis. The land produced less, but the tax demand from the state, calculated on the land's assumed potential, remained cruelly fixed. A province could find itself caught between a shrinking harvest and an unchanging imperial quota, pushing communities into debt, famine, or abandonment. These climatic pressures did not cause the fall of Rome, but they acted as a powerful multiplier of existing vulnerabilities. A supply chain already strained by piracy and insecurity now had to cope with a fundamental shortage at its source. The great grain fleets from Egypt might have sailed, but their holds could have been less full each year. The tax collectors, demanding their payments in kind, would have found villages with emptier granaries. This environmental stress helps explain why some regions seem to have collapsed faster than others, and why the empire's ability to bounce back from crisis grew weaker over time. The economic machine was not only breaking down logistically and financially, it was also running out of fuel. The land itself, once seemingly boundless in its generosity, was quietly withdrawing its support. The story of Rome's fall is incomplete without its remarkable counterpoint, the empire that did not fall. While the West fractured into a patchwork of self-sufficient estates and barbarian kingdoms, the Eastern Roman Empire, centered on the magnificent new capital of Constantinople, endured for another 1,000 years. This was not a matter of luck, but of profound structural differences that allowed the East to survive the very pressures that shattered the West. Its greatest advantage was a more resilient, deeply monetized economy. While the West succumbed to hyperinflation and retreated into barter, the East maintained the integrity of its gold coinage, the Solidus. This reliable currency lubricated trade, allowed for efficient taxation, and gave the state a powerful tool to pay its armies and bureaucrats without resorting to the destructive cycle of debasement. Trust in money meant commerce could flow, and the government could plan with a predictable budget, a stability the West had lost decades before. Geography also granted the East critical logistical strengths. Its capital, Constantinople, was a fortress city surrounded on three sides by water, with legendary defensive walls on its landward side. More importantly, its most vital supply line was short and immensely secure. The fertile grain fields of Egypt were just a sail across the relatively calm and controlled waters of the eastern Mediterranean. A steady, protected stream of Egyptian wheat flowed directly into the city's harbors, ensuring that the heart of the empire was never starved as Rome had been. This was the ultimate contrast, where the West's supply lines were long, overland and vulnerable, stretching from Britain to Italy. The East's were maritime, shorter, and easier to defend with a powerful navy. The Eastern Empire did not have to guard thousands of miles of river frontier like the Rhine and Danube. It had the natural moat of the Aegean and the Black Seas, and a narrow, fortified land border in the Balkans. This economic and logistical health supported a richer, more vibrant urban and commercial base. Cities like Alexandria, Antioch, and Ephesus never experienced the same scale of depopulation and decay as their Western counterparts. They remained bustling centers of industry, scholarship, and trade, connected to the lucrative Silk Road networks that brought wealth from Persia, India, and China. The tax revenue from these thriving urban centers filled the imperial coffers, funding a professional administration and a formidable military. The Eastern Empire faced immense pressures, from Persian armies to later Arab conquests, but its core economic engine remained intact. It could adapt, retrench, and survive because it never lost the fundamental tools of a complex state: sound money and secure supply. The lesson is stark. The Western Empire collapsed not because it was attacked, but because it had become too brittle to withstand the attack. The East endured because it retained the flexibility and integration that define a living economy. In the end, the fate of Rome was a choice between two different models of survival, and only one was built to last. By the middle of the 5th century, the Western Roman state was no longer an empire in any meaningful economic sense. It was a hollow title stretched over a landscape of fragments. The silent killers had done their work, and the damage was now irreversible. A series of interlocked failures that left the imperial government powerless in its own lands. Hyperinflation had completed its corrosive task, rendering the official bronze currency utterly useless for any serious fiscal purpose. The mountains of nummy minted to pay soldiers could not purchase loyalty or supplies, only contempt. Money, the great abstraction that had unified the Mediterranean marketplace, was now just noisy scrap metal, incapable of funding a state or facilitating complex trade. Simultaneously, the physical networks that moved the empire's lifeblood lay in ruins. The secure roads were memories, choked by bandits and crumbling from civic neglect. The sea lanes were contested, with the Vandal kingdom now controlling the western Mediterranean from its stolen African base. The critical supply chains for grain, oil, and military hardware were not just strained, they were severed. A governor in Gaul could not request reinforcements from Italy if the ships could not sail safely, and the city of Rome could not command bread from a province it no longer controlled. Logistics had collapsed from a system of imperial command into a series of desperate, local improvisations. This breakdown forced the tax system into a primitive state. With coin worthless and provinces isolated, the government abandoned all pretense of monetary revenue. It now operated purely on a system of collection in kind, demanding specific sacks of grain, lengths of cloth, and heads of livestock from the lands it still nominally administered. This was not an efficient levy, but a blunt extraction that treated the empire as a collection of isolated farms to be harvested. The sophisticated treasury that once managed a budget was reduced to a glorified warehouse manager, counting tangible goods instead of currency, its flexibility and reach gone. The most profound transformation, however, was in the daily life of the economy itself. Long-distance commerce had evaporated. The economic activity that remained had relocalized completely, shrinking to the radius a cart could travel safely in a day. Towns and fortified villas produced for themselves, traded through barter with immediate neighbors, and looked no further than their own horizons. The vast, integrated economic zone of the Pax Romana had shattered into countless self-contained cells. The result was a stark inversion of power. The imperial government in Ravenna still issued edicts and appointed officials, but it no longer controlled the essential levers of economic power. It could not reliably pay an army because the money it paid with was fake. It could not move troops because the roads and ships were not secure. It could not tax wealth because wealth was now hidden in land and stockpiles beyond its reach. True authority had flowed downward, settling with the local landowner who controlled the grain stores, the regional warlord who commanded the loyalty of soldiers he fed from his own lands, and the bishop who organized the distribution of charity. The emperor became a distant figurehead, while the real empire was a patchwork of self-sufficient islands, each having already learned to survive without Rome. The state did not fall, it was simply left behind, its mechanisms of control rendered silent by an economy that had moved on. The final deposition of the last Western emperor in 476 was not a cataclysm, but a quiet administrative footnote. For decades, the real power had not resided in a palace, but in the granaries of local lords and the loyalty of regional armies. This reveals a crucial historical truth: the dramatic narrative of a mighty empire falling to barbarian invaders is a profound oversimplification. It is a story told from the top down, focused on political theater. The deeper, more accurate story is one of economic hollowing out, a process so complete that the political dissolution was merely the final, logical symptom. The state did not topple, it simply evaporated from within, leaving behind only its empty shell. Think of it not as a building struck by lightning, but as a building consumed by dry rot. The lightning strike, the barbarian King Odoacer taking the throne, was visible and dramatic, but the structural integrity had already been destroyed by the slow, silent decay of its economic foundations. For generations, the central government had been losing its essential reasons for being. Its primary function was to provide security, administer justice, and facilitate commerce. Yet by the 5th century, it could do none of these effectively. It could not pay its soldiers with meaningful currency, so security became a local burden. It could not guarantee safe passage for goods, so commerce retreated behind private walls. It could not collect taxes in a useful form, so its ability to project power vanished. The emperor became a distant symbol, while the actual work of society, organizing production, resolving disputes, and providing defense, was handled by the fortified villa, the local bishop, or the Germanic warlord who now controlled the land. This reframing changes how we see every actor in the final act. The so-called barbarian kingdoms were not destroying a functioning state. They were moving into a power vacuum and taking over existing, localized systems of control. A Visigothic king in Toulouse or a Vandal ruler in Carthage did not invent a new way to collect grain or muster troops. They simply took over the mechanisms of the large estate economy that had already replaced the imperial model. They became the new patrons, the new landlords on a grand scale. The Roman population did not experience 476 as a shocking end, because for most, the practical reality of Roman government had ended years, even decades earlier. Their world had already shrunk to the horizon of their local stronghold, their economic life reduced to the barter and subsistence of their immediate community. The change in a faraway capital was irrelevant to the daily rhythm of survival. Therefore, the collapse was not a single event, but a long process of substitution. The integrated monetary economy was substituted by localized barter. The imperial supply chain was substituted by estate-based self-sufficiency. The professional, salaried army was substituted by hereditary, land-based militias. The centralized bureaucracy was substituted by personal patronage. Each substitution made the population less dependent on the central state, until one day, they simply did not need it at all. The empire did not fall, it was made obsolete by its own failure to maintain the economic conditions that gave it purpose. The political end was just the final paperwork, the official recognition that a system which could no longer pay, supply, or control anything had ceased to exist in everything but name. This shifts the mystery from a question of who brought Rome down to a far more universal question: how does any complex system become so brittle that its collapse is felt only as a distant echo? The physical proof of this collapse is buried in the earth and scattered across the seafloor. Archaeology provides the tangible evidence for the silent crisis, turning abstract economic theories into concrete reality. One of the most telling clues is not a grand monument, but a simple clay pot filled with coins, hidden in a hurry and never retrieved. Across the former Western Empire, from the fields of Britain to the vineyards of Gaul, thousands of coin hoards have been unearthed, dating precisely to the turbulent 3rd through 5th centuries. These buried treasures are not signs of wealth but of profound fear and instability. People were not saving for a rainy day, they were hiding their last valuable assets from imminent threat, whether that threat was a barbarian raid, a marauding army, or the state's own tax collectors. The composition of these hoards is especially revealing. They rarely contain the new, debased bronze coins flooding the market. Instead, they are filled with older, high silver content coins from centuries past, or even with clipped and cut fragments of silver plate. This selective hoarding screams a loss of faith. It shows that the public had already judged the official currency as worthless and was desperately trying to preserve value by clinging to the last remnants of sound money from a more stable age. Each buried pot is a silent vote of no confidence in the Roman economic system, a private act of survival that, when multiplied by thousands, drained the life from the monetized economy. The story of vanishing trade is written on the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. Underwater archaeology has mapped the wrecks of Roman merchant vessels, and the pattern is unmistakable. The number of discovered shipwrecks peaks during the 1st and 2nd centuries, the height of the Pax Romana, when the sea lanes were secure and commerce was booming. Then the curve drops steeply from the 3rd century onward. This decline in shipwrecks is not a sign of improved nautical skill, but of a catastrophic drop in the volume of shipping itself. Fewer ships were sailing because there was less long-distance trade to conduct. The risks of piracy, the lack of profitable markets due to hyperinflation, and the breakdown of centralized demand from cities and armies made the once lucrative routes unviable. A sunken ship from the 1st century might be carrying a diverse cargo of Spanish olive oil, Italian wine, and fine Gallic pottery, destined for a dozen different ports. A later wreck, if one is found at all, is more likely to carry a single, bulk commodity like grain, a sign of the shrinking, state-managed trade that remained. The quieting of the Mediterranean was not peaceful. It was the sound of economic connectivity shutting down. On land, the transformation is etched into the stones of the countryside. The Roman villa, the ultimate symbol of peaceful, agrarian wealth, underwent a dramatic metamorphosis. Early imperial villas are excavations of luxury, revealing intricate mosaic floors depicting mythological scenes, elegant bath suites with underfloor heating, and collections of imported fineware. They speak of confidence, connectivity, and disposable income. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the archaeology changes completely. The same villa sites show signs of radical modification. The beautiful mosaics are often patched with crude brickwork. Spacious rooms are subdivided into smaller, more functional spaces. Most tellingly, thick defensive walls are built around the perimeter, and watchtowers are added. The aesthetic focus on leisure and beauty is replaced by an overwhelming focus on security and subsistence. Workshops for metalworking and weaving appear within the fortified compound. The villa is no longer a pleasant country retreat connected to a wider world. It is a defensible production center aiming for self-sufficiency. This architectural shift from open luxury to closed fortification is the physical manifestation of the economic retreat. It is the blueprint of a society that could no longer rely on distant markets or imperial protection, a society that had turned inward, building its walls higher as its economic horizons shrank. These three strands of evidence, the hidden hoards, the silent sea lanes, and the fortified homes, form an irrefutable material record. They tell us the fracture was not a political story happening in palaces, but a daily reality experienced by merchants, farmers, and landowners, a reality of fear, isolation, and the grim prioritization of survival over prosperity. The economic principles that fractured Rome are not relics of a distant past, but recurring patterns in human history. We can hear distinct echoes of Rome's monetary collapse in much later crises, though the specific actors and technologies change. Consider the hyperinflation that struck Germany in the early 1920s. The Weimar Republic, burdened by war debts and reparations, began printing money with catastrophic abandon. Just as the Roman denarius transformed from silver to bronze, the German mark became a symbol of absurdity, with people needing wheelbarrows full of banknotes to buy a single loaf of bread. The core mechanism was identical to Rome's. A government, facing impossible fiscal pressures, chose to degrade its currency, destroying public trust and wiping out the life savings of the middle class. In both cases, the result was a flight to real assets, a desperate scramble for tangible goods, land, or stable foreign currency. The social contract dissolved, creating a bitterness and instability that paved the way for radical political change. This pattern underscores a timeless truth: when a state breaks faith with the money it issues, it breaks faith with its citizens, unraveling the very fabric of the society it governs. Supply chain fragility reveals another universal lesson. The Roman Empire's dependence on Egyptian grain and Spanish metals created a spectacularly efficient but dangerously centralized system. A similar, though far more rapid, vulnerability was exposed in our own time during the global pandemic of the early 2020s. Modern just-in-time logistics, a marvel of efficiency that delivers goods across oceans with pinpoint accuracy, assumed constant global mobility. When ports closed, factories stalled, and transport links ceased, the system experienced a shock that felt hauntingly familiar. Store shelves emptied of specific goods, not due to a lack of global supply, but because a single bottleneck in a distant country could halt the flow for millions. Like the Roman villas turning inward, businesses and nations were forced to reconsider the risks of over-specialization and extreme reliance on long, complex chains. The principle is the same, whether applied to ancient sailing ships or modern container vessels. Any system that prioritizes lean efficiency over resilience becomes brittle. It functions magnificently under perfect conditions, but lacks the redundancy to absorb a major shock. These historical echoes are not about predicting doom, but about recognizing fundamental pressures. The loss of trust in currency and the fragility of extended logistics are not Roman inventions. They are persistent challenges for any complex, interconnected society. The Roman experience serves as a long-term case study, showing us what happens when these pressures are ignored for generations, when short-term fixes like currency debasement become permanent policy, and when the security-maintaining trade routes is taken for granted. Their story is a cautionary tale about the invisible foundations of power. It reminds us that the true strength of a civilization lies not in the height of its monuments or the size of its armies, but in the trust its people place in their systems of exchange and the reliability of the networks that bring them sustenance. When those two pillars crack, everything built upon them begins to lean, and eventually, no matter how grand the structure, it must find a new shape or fall. The Roman world did not vanish, it simply changed shape. The economic fracture we have followed for so long did not end with a political event in 476. It settled into a new and lasting reality, one that would define the next 500 years. The late empire's retreat from currency, its shattered supply chains, and its inward turn toward self-sufficient estates were not temporary crises. They became the permanent foundations of the early Middle Ages. This was the true legacy of the fracture, a world built from the pieces Rome left behind. Out of the economic wreckage, a new system slowly crystallized, one where power, wealth, and daily life were organized in a way that would have been utterly foreign to a citizen of the Pax Romana. The vibrant, urban, cash-based Mediterranean economy was gone, replaced by a rural, localized world where the only real wealth was land, and the only real security was a personal bond of loyalty. Consider the daily reality for a farmer in 6th century Gaul or Italy. His horizon was no longer the empire but the manor. He lived and worked on a large estate owned by a powerful lord, who might be a descendant of a Roman senator, a Germanic chieftain, or a hybrid of both. This farmer, like the late Roman colonists before him, was bound to this land. He was not a slave, but he was not free to leave. In exchange for the right to farm a plot for his family, he owed the lord a share of his harvest, labor on the lord's personal fields, and various other dues often paid in kind with chickens, eggs, or handmade goods. Money was rarely part of the equation. The complex Roman tax system, which once extracted coin to fund a central state, had evaporated. In its place was a simpler, more direct extraction, where the local lord was both the protector and the primary beneficiary of the land's production. This was the economic bedrock of what scholars would later call feudalism, a system not imposed by conquest, but which grew organically from the necessity of the post-Roman landscape. The grand, interconnected trade networks were now just faint memories. Long-distance commerce did not disappear entirely, but it became rare, risky, and limited to a few luxury items for the very elite, spices, silk, or jewels transported along dangerous routes. For the vast majority of people, everything they needed had to be produced within a few miles of where they lived. The village or manor aimed for self-sufficiency. It grew its own food, forged its own simple tools, wove its own rough cloth. The economic specialization that had made Rome rich, where one region produced wine, another olive oil, and another pottery, was a lost art. This localization meant a dramatic simplification of material life. The fine, mass-produced red gloss pottery of the early empire was replaced by handmade, locally fired wares. Architectural techniques for large-scale building were forgotten. The economic energy that had once built aqueducts and bathhouses was now entirely consumed by the basic struggle for subsistence and local defense. Centralized taxation, the lifeblood of the Roman state, became impossible. A king like Charlemagne in the 8th century, despite his grand title, did not have a treasury like Augustus. He could not levy a monetary tax across his realm because there was no unified currency system and no bureaucracy to collect it. Instead, his wealth and power came directly from the royal estates, the fiscal lands scattered across his kingdom. He and his court would travel from one estate to another, consuming the food and goods produced there, a practice called the iter. To support his wars, he did not raise taxes. He called upon his great lords, who were obligated to provide armed men based on the land they held. This was government funded not by coin, but by personal obligation and the direct produce of the land. The state, in the Roman sense, had been replaced by a network of personal loyalties linking the king to his counts, the counts to their local knights, and the knights to the peasants who worked the soil. Power was no longer an abstract authority emanating from a capital city. It was a tangible relationship between a lord and the people who depended on him for protection and justice. Thus, the early medieval economy was not a new invention. It was the direct descendant of the late Roman world's adaptations to collapse. The fortified villa became the manor. The bound colonist became the serf. The local warlord or landowner became the feudal lord. The barter economy and the rejection of debased coinage became a normalized, non-monetary system. What we witness in the centuries after Rome is not a dark age of chaos, but a period of slow, painful reorganization around a new, simpler set of economic rules, rules born from necessity in a world without safe roads, trustworthy money, or a distant emperor to provide order. The fracture had healed, but into a different shape entirely, one that would hold for centuries until new forces, like the revival of towns and long-distance trade, began to weave a more connected world once again. The story of Rome's fall, then, is ultimately a story of transformation. It asks us to look beyond the dramatic end of an empire and see the quiet, stubborn beginnings of what came next, a world built from the very pieces the old world could no longer hold together. The true collapse of Rome was not an event but a process, a slow fracture driven relentlessly by two silent engines. Hyperinflation destroyed the trust that held a vast economy together, while supply chain failure starved it of its lifeblood. One robbed the state of its financial legitimacy, the other of its physical reach. Together, they created a world where the imperial government could no longer perform its most basic functions. It could not pay its soldiers with meaningful currency, it could not move troops or grain across its own territory, and it could not collect revenue in a useful form. The political superstructure of emperors and senates became a hollow shell, a facade resting on an economic foundation that had long since crumbled away. This is why the final political dissolution in the late 5th century felt less like a conquest and more like a formality. The empire had already become ungovernable because the tools of governance, sound money, and secure logistics had ceased to exist. The state was not overthrown, it was simply left behind by a population that had already learned to live without it. The deeper lesson here is one of profound interdependence. A complex state cannot exist without a stable medium of exchange to facilitate trade and taxation, nor without reliable networks to move goods, information, and force. When currency becomes an object of distrust, society turns inward. When supply lines snap, specialization and prosperity wither. Rome's story demonstrates that military might and cultural prestige are ultimately powerless against the slow, grinding erosion of economic fundamentals. The empire did not fall to a more powerful enemy. It fractured under the weight of its own internal contradictions. If you found this journey into the economic mysteries of the ancient world compelling, there are countless other historical puzzles where finance and logistics shaped destiny. Consider exploring the role of silver from the New World in fueling Spain's inflation and imperial overreach, or how the spice trade routes redrew the map of global power. The past is filled with silent, powerful forces waiting to be uncovered. Thank you for joining this exploration.